Dick Grayson. Like, man, guy is a very important character, particularly in the Batman mythos. He's more than just Batman's sidekick, and evolves in a lot of ways to be what we would have hoped Batman would have been. There's some subtle differences between these guys that slowly over time make these huge differences. Now, he is the light that survived the darkness. This is how I would describe Dick. Like, before he was Robin, he was already used to living this devil life, not as a vigilante, but he was a performer with the Flying Graysons, obviously, his family. And he learned very on that, survival is about balance. His world depended on precision, grace, and the ability to smile through danger. That's how he lived. Then he gets this trauma, the fall, the rope that snapped, the lights dimmed, and all of a sudden all those screams were now, the applause is now screams. So that night at the circus wasn't just a tragedy, this was creation of a mask. This is where Bruce Wayne turned inward after his trauma. Dick kind of turned outward, right? So before performance was his coping mechanism. He already had this. The act of smiling was already armor. So every joke, every smirk that we saw out of Robin, this actually wasn't his immaturity, it was his defiance. What he was saying was, I'm not going to let the darkness win. That's subtle thing that really is going to mark who he is in his character arc. And I definitely appreciate it, though I've never been a big fan of the character myself. But let's look at him in his role as the shadow of the bat. And this is how he's, most well defined and justifiably so. Now, Bruce didn't adopt, Dick Grayson out of compassion. He doesn't do anything out of compassion. He adopted him out of this recognition of himself in some ways. He saw the reflection of himself in the boy with the trauma, the same rage, that same loneliness. But here's where the difference, it starts here, but it goes out. Bruce actually never healed. Dick refused to rot. So as Robin, he was forced into Bruce's world of calculated revenge and emotional repression. He learned the tactics, the silence, the pain, all that, but unlike Bruce, his pain doesn't define him. He absorbed the darkness without letting it consume his internal light, his optimism. And this is where you start to see him really take some stark differences between who Bruce is and who he is. But obviously he's growing up in the shadow of this man who weaponized trauma that was left. He still has this need to prove himself, or prove his worth at least, but he doesn't do it without seeking approval. His subconscious guilt of being the better version of Bruce is something that really sits on his mind all the time, because we can't help but, by seeing his ability to have compassion, to still have love, that puts a glaring light on Bruce. That's really what it does. He's a part of Bruce's psyche, and I see him as the part of Bruce that learned how to love and lead and laugh. And this is very important because we see him in his role with the Titans. And in that role, he's a leader, 100%. Now, the things about him is that he's made plenty of mistakes, but he's, from what I've seen, been accountable. Sometimes it took a little longer than we might like, but he would ultimately be accountable. To be able to stand in front of a group and say, I messed up, I was wrong, that takes a lot. Like, Bruce never had that. His ability to understand communicating with people on multiple levels, bonding with people, giving emotional reciprocity, having emotional intelligence, to be able to take criticism and then, turn it inward and still come out. He said something profound to Connor whilst Connor was struggling with a psychological attack, and he said he comes in the sight to his brain. This was a huge moment. He is literally in Connor's head, and he says to him, Connor's freaking out, and he says to him, tell me how I can help you. That's something Bruce would never be capable of doing. So we see that he highlights the lacking in Bruce, whereas like Damian and Jason kind of reflect his darker, Jason I really think is the dark Batman, is what he is. Whereas Dick is he's Batman who found the light. So if Batman is this lunar energy, Dick is by contrast through mythology this solar energy. He's radiant. He represents what Batman could have been if he had simply let life enter into his life. So psychologically, Dick's empathy is both his greatest power and where he gets his deepest wound. He carries other people's pains. the Titans, Barbara, Wally, even Bruce, he carries it because he understands by his connection to people and how strong it is, it makes him understand how disconnected Bruce is. So he understands that Bruce has this like lacking that he wishes he could help him bridge that gap. But his behavior also breeds some kind of codependency because he starts to define himself through the others. Bruce is isolation to the extreme. Dick is attachment to the extreme, which is why he has this penchant for taking in like wounded strays. That's what he does. Now, when he evolves into Nightwing, this is the rebirth of himself. It wasn't just a costume change. To me, this is more of like a psychological revolution. This is the son killing the father's ghost. This Nightwing is Dick's individual nature, merging light and the shadow together. He's no longer runs from Batman, nor does he emulate him. He integrates what he learns and transforms that into something that's functional, it's hopeful, it can even be romantic. The blue on the suit isn't random, it represents balance between the cold intellect of Bruce and the idealism of Superman. Bruce being the black in the costume and Superman being the blue. So he stands between those two extremes where we would say with Cal, you're too naive, right? You don't understand the nuances, and on a lot of levels, you're not subtle at all. Whereas Bruce, you're too calculating, right? You're so devoid of all that. We want you to have a little bit of Cal's naivety. Kal-El embodies hope. Bruce embodies like nihilism. So somewhere in between the two, we get a character like Nightwing who really just brings both those things together. So he becomes the best, morally of these two guys, not power-wise in that way. But there is a cost for everything he does, and his need to fix others so badly makes him vulnerable, and he takes on risk. He risks heartbreak, he risks exhaustion, he's been betrayed, he's been manipulated, he's been broken down. But this is the key part, he still keeps rising. This is very Maya Angelou, right? That's very poetic, and still I rise. If there was ever a hero that embodied that phrase, and still I rise, it is this guy. The tragedy of Dick Grayson isn't that he lives in Batman's shadow, it's that he chooses to carry on out of love. He will do everything with optimism in this very cynical world. He even tried to save, Jason. And some people can't be reached, but Dick, man, he like I said, he does make mistakes. We see it, but he is the human spirit, just proof of it, just proof that trauma can birth empathy instead of obsession, that a child in tragedy can grow up being like the brightest light in the room, that sometimes they learn to care more about people because they see what happened to them when they didn't get that care themselves. So this is a guy who really has an open heart. That's really where his mindset is. He's a walking kind of paradox, and he confronts that about himself. He doesn't hide him and doesn't allow it to define him in a negative way. He always chooses, and he always will choose to embrace love, to embrace hope, and to help other people, which is a very healthy attitude. And overall, while he's got his issues himself, man, this is a guy I'm very positive about in terms of his leadership role, and I can really understand the part of Bruce that is still there and this side of Bruce that he represents.